recording in the next, hopefully, few days to join the first and the second session. So this is week 3. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. We will be running through till somewhere around about 5 o'clock. Got some nice content to get through today. We may finish a little bit earlier, but if we do finish up earlier, we're more than happy to kind of answer questions that any of you might have, myself and my colleagues. So as I said, if everyone can keep themselves on mute, if you do want to ask anything or contribute, best place for that is the chat box, so do use that during the course of the session. So I am one of the tutors, one of the directors, actually one of the founders of First Intuition. So I've been training accountants for nearly 25 years now, for various different qualifications, you know, including, and if you remember, those of you that were with us 2 weeks ago, we heard from the AAT and the ICAEW as two particular awarding bodies that accountants sometimes do exams with and get qualifications with. There are other awarding bodies, other institutes, and I've been training for those for well over 20 years. In fact, Tim, I think you've just been training just over 30 years, haven't you? So you've got, 60 or 70 years worth of experience of dealing with accountancy trainees just on this call alone. So great place to be asking questions. So you know, do use the chat box. I've got a poll that I'm going to be using a little bit later, so I'll be interested to see your responses to the poll later. And as I said, just make sure you don't share any personal information through the chat box. So no phone numbers, no email addresses, no full names. That would be fantastic. So the way we have been running this summer school, this online summer school, we are doing it over 4 weeks. So we've already had 2 weeks. We had 2 weeks ago a session looking at the different routes into accountancy. We talked about, you know, some of the different roles that exist within accountancy and finance. You might remember we talked about bookkeeping, we talked about financial accountants, management accountants, auditors, corporate finance, insolvency, tax advisors, all manner of different roles. One of the things that really appeals to me about accountancy is just the variety of different roles you can potentially work in across so many different types of organizations, so many different sectors, so many countries you can potentially work in. A great, you know, for me, it was a great passport into all sorts of potential careers. We specifically heard, if you remember, from the AAT, very good qualification, particularly for school or college leavers as a kind of entry-level technician qualification. And we heard from the ICAEW, and often AAT students move into ICAEW, but actually a very good graduate route actually into the chartered accountancy qualifications for those of you that are kind of at university or just leaving university. So that was week 1, 2 weeks ago. So hopefully you've already received the recording of that session. Then last week, we actually delved into some of those roles in accountancy in a bit more detail. We did a few little interactive role plays looking at some of the specific activities that accountants are involved in. We played with some numbers. We talked about some more strategic issues. One of the things that I love about accountancy is the way it can actually lead you all the way to the board of directors of organizations. And so it can actually see you ending up, you know, in sort of strategic charge of large companies. I think that could be quite exciting. So hopefully we'll get the recording of last week's session out in the next day or two to everybody. Today, we're going to be looking at transferable skills. So starting to actually think about what specific skills, well, firstly, might be used and required in accountancy. And I bet you're going to be quite surprised with some of them, but also start thinking about the transferable skills that hopefully some of you watching might already have been developing yourselves and actually can therefore bring to play in particularly in interview situations. Because you can imagine one of the big questions that you may be asked in an interview will be around, what do you think you can bring to an organization or a finance function or an accountancy firm? What skills do you think you've got that would be particularly useful? And again, I think you'll perhaps be surprised by how many skills you may already possess that will be very, very useful in that sort of situation. So we're going to be focusing on transferable skills today. And then next week, we're going to finish with, I think, one of the highlights actually, which is very much looking at the process of trying to secure a role or a job in an accountancy entry position, perhaps in a firm or in an organization. We're going to do a bit of sort of CV advice, bit of interview skills advice. I think that's a really useful session actually we're going to be running next week. But on with this week. So hopefully by the end of today's session, let's start with some nice aims to kick off with. So hopefully we're going to go through the difference between what we mean by technical skills, the skills that are very relevant to a particular job, and transferable skills, the skills that actually are easier to transfer perhaps into different industries. We'll talk specifically about the skills needed for accountancy roles and see whether actually some of them might be technical skills, but some of them might well be transferable skills, and they're particularly the ones you may already have developed at this point in your lives and in your education, and if you've had jobs yourselves in the past. And we're going to talk a little bit about, where you may already use them and how you can potentially develop them, to make yourselves perhaps more employable, so that it's more likely that you might be able to secure the kind of job that you would like, particularly if you are interested in kind of pursuing a career in accountancy. I don't know whether the last couple of weeks have sparked any interest amongst anybody on the call. I hope so, because I've really enjoyed them so far. But let's start off then. So let's kick off just thinking about this difference between what are sometimes described as technical skills and transferable skills. So let's start by thinking about a footballer. Let's not even worry about accountancy, because for a lot of you, accountancy may be a world you've not got any real experience or familiarity with. But whether you're talking about, a footballer or a hockey player, or, my daughters both play netball, there are skills required in those sorts of sports that we could describe as either technical or transferable. So I did a bit of a brainstorm and came up with what I thought were a sort of series of skills required in football. You imagine the same would be very relevant for hockey or whatever else it might be. And so, for instance, if you want to be a good footballer, if you want to play football to the highest level, and I never was any good at football whatsoever, so I'm very much basing this on conversations with friends rather than personal first-hand knowledge. But I'm guessing that if you want to be a first-class footballer, you're going to need to be good at dribbling, good at passing, perhaps good at taking penalties. You need to have that spatial awareness of kind of what's going on around you on the field, stamina to see yourself through an entire match, speed to be able to beat your opponents to the ball. Now, they are definitely skills, I think, that a footballer is going to require. But can you see those skills are all very, very relevant and specific to playing football? Say taking penalties. Being good at taking penalties is useful in football. It's not all that useful in any other aspect of life. I've never had to take a penalty in my life. It makes little difference if I'm any good at taking penalties. I never had any aspirations to play football. So you've got these technical skills that are very specific to a particular job or activity or role. But you've also got a variety of other skills that I still think are very important to be a good footballer, but are much more transferable, i.e., they're also relevant to lots and lots of other jobs, lots of other activities, lots of other roles. So for instance, I think it's fair to say, much as you get the glory players, the Ronaldos or whoever who are individually brilliant at football, they can't win matches on their own. They've got to be part of a coherent team. They've got to be able to deliver that kind of teamwork. So I think, another important skill in a first-class footballer is teamwork. Also, self-motivation. The fact that you've actually got to put yourself through hours and hours of training. Not everybody's got that kind of commitment and grit. Overcoming setbacks. I'm sure, in fact, I grew up in Scotland. I was a big fan of Hibs. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Hibernian FC up in Edinburgh. But I think as a player for Hibs, you probably have to overcome setbacks an awful lot. They weren't necessarily one of the best Scottish teams, so they lose probably more than they win. And actually, I think in any avenue in life, overcoming setbacks, because nothing always goes brilliantly. There's always going to be things that go wrong. There's always going to be failure. It's actually a very important part of any part of life, I think, is overcoming setbacks. Things like punctuality, turning up for training on time, turning up for the big matches on time, not being late. Communication, so the ability, whether you're on the field or even during training, to make sure you can communicate with other players, communicate with your captain, communicate with your coach. And if you are the captain, what about leadership? The ability to take your team forward. Now, those skills, I think, are very important to become a good football player, but can you all see that they're much more broadly relevant than taking penalties? You know, in my life, has teamwork been important? Yes. Has self-motivation, communication been important? Absolutely. And you can imagine the number of different jobs, different roles, different activities that those skills are actually equally applicable to as they are to football, whereas dribbling, passing, take on penalties, actually, they're not particularly relevant. And one thing I think, you know, if you take one thing away from this session, it's when you go to interview, you know, and this can be whether it's for a job or even if you're looking at, you know, further education, you're going to university or whatever it might be, you know, doing some courses. If an interviewer is asking you about skills you have, skills you feel that you've developed, I think they're always going to be way more interested in the transferable skills than the specific technical skills. You know, you can imagine if, you know, if you're going for an interview and let's say you were, you know, captain of your local football team, you go for the interview and they're interested in that because that's, you know, that's showing some skills. And they say, what skills do you think you learnt as captain of the football team? You know, if you start talking about dribbling the ball and taking penalties, I'm not sure that's going to get you a job in an accountancy firm. But if you can talk about the leadership you showed, if you can talk about the way you managed the team and helped them communicate with each other, and if you can talk about how you lost a big match, but you pulled the team back together and won the next 10 matches, that's way more relevant than some of those technical skills. So, you know, key thing probably to make sure you're taking away from this is that in interview situations, it's the transferable skills you probably want to be talking more about than the specific technical skills. So hopefully that's a good starting point. Now, we've talked about football there, obviously, when none of, well, I don't know, I'm suggesting none of us want a career as a footballer, but maybe there's some. In fact, we've got some students, actually, one of our AAT students, she actually plays for Arsenal and for England. She's one of the Lionesses, actually, so very successful football player, but she is actually studying for AAT because actually she knows that football is not a career for life and she wants to make sure she's got a good solid qualification behind her. But let's just think about accountants. So let's just start very generally, and I want these in the chat box, and my colleagues are going to hopefully translate some ideas over to me. Just start chucking ideas into the chat box. What skills do you think accountants need to be good at their jobs? I can see a lot of action going on in the chat box already. Well done. Good to see people getting involved. And if my colleagues, as soon as you start seeing interesting ones, feel free to start chucking them in for us.
Communications come up twice.
Okay, so communication, you know, accountants have got to be able to talk to people, maybe to find things out or to tell them what's going on. So yeah, communication.
Yep, a popular one coming up again more than once now, analytical skills.
Analytical skills, the ability to analyze situations and actually work out what's going on. And actually the analytical skills, I think, are very closely linked to the communication, because typically you might analyze a situation and then communicate what you've found out to other people.
A few people mentioned attention to detail.
Absolutely. Accountants have got to be very accurate. So that's in terms of maybe inputting information. You know, if an invoice is £360, you don't want to input £260 or the system starts to fall apart.
Teamwork's come up quite a lot.
A bit of teamwork, yeah. I mean, accountants work in teams, both within a finance team, but accountants are actually a fundamental part of the wider team of a business, perhaps.
Yeah, and additionally, strategic thinking and decision making.
You know, we've talked about accountants sometimes getting to the top of that pyramid, the strategic level of decision making in an organization. You know, other skills perhaps accountants might need would be, well, maybe mathematical ability. You know, although accountants don't need to be mathematicians, you need to be numerate, you need to be able to actually deal with numbers in an accountancy situation.
Quite interesting. Technology and data analytics.
Oh, blimey, excellent. I mean, that's certainly a big area that's been growing in accountancy, is, you know, using technology to do some of that analysis. You can imagine if you're a large organization like Amazon, say, you know, the sheer number of transactions means that an individual can't possibly be looking at every single transaction. So actually you can use powerful software platforms to crunch that data and to actually make sense of it, identify trends, you know, almost you know, get some kind of value out of the data that you've got.
Zohar's put in an interesting one, Gareth, a willingness to learn, which I think is pretty good, accepting that nobody knows everything.
Yeah. Every day reminds me of exactly that fact, that I don't know everything, because, but you know, the world changes so much. Absolutely. You know, I think somebody once said, you know, the day you're done learning, you're done, because you've got to, you know, lifelong learning is a fundamental part, actually, the qualifications we train for. So actually that was quite scattergun, and I deliberately kept it very vague and very open in terms of skills that accountants need. But let's hone it down a little bit more. So I now want people to think about, and you might get some ideas that we've already been throwing around, because I now want us to think, firstly, which skills do an accountant need that you could describe purely as technical skills that are reasonably specific to accountancy itself? So let's see some ideas in the chat box around technical skills in accountancy.
Excel skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, spreadsheets are often used by accountants, and that's definitely a very specific technical skill. I imagine other professions use spreadsheets and Excel to a degree, but probably nothing like accountants do. So, you know, we train accountants in using sort of pivot tables and, you know, more advanced functions in Excel, which most people wouldn't ever touch with a barge pole. So, you know, sophisticated Excel skills, absolutely. I guess linked to that, actually, maybe there are various kind of computerized accounting platforms. Some of you may have heard of things like Sage and Xero. So a lot of accountants will be very familiar with Xero as an accounting package. Great skill if you're an accountant, great skill if you're a bookkeeper, not so useful if you're a footballer or something. Any other points coming out here?
Gareth, just add in that QuickBooks has also been mentioned on there, because other accounting packages are available.
Absolutely. So QuickBooks and Sage and Xero, they're probably the major ones. You know, there are others that's like cash flow and stuff, but you know, they all do a similar job of increasingly automating and making the accounting process online.
So yeah, we had a double entry, reading balance sheets, and data visualization.
Oh, right. So, and you know, certainly things like reading balance sheets, you can imagine as an accountant, you know, you do need to know, for instance, you need to know double entry bookkeeping. You need to know debits and credits, which some of you may have potentially touched on at this stage in your journeys. You need to know about nominal ledgers, trial balances. You need to know about journals and suspense accounts. You need to know about P&Ls, balance sheets. You need to know about how tax works. So, you know, in fact, you can imagine if you're a tax advisor, you need to know in a lot of detail how tax works. So there are some very specific technical areas that you cover, and you will learn these if you go into studying things like AAT or ICAEW. But would you agree, you know, knowing tax in a lot of detail is useful if you are going to be an accountant, but it's not particularly useful if you then want to change careers and become a, I don't know, garden designer or something. Not be particularly useful. So those are technical skills. And the thing I wanted to emphasize in this session is that, you know, particularly if you go for interview, it's useful if you know an accounting package. It's useful if you know how to use Excel. Useful if you've got a bit of experience of dealing with tax. But actually, that's not what they tend to be looking for. Because, you know, the technical skills, the thing about technical skills is you can train people in the technical skills. You know, you can train people to know how to do tax. You can train people to use Excel. In fact, it's very much what First Intuition do. You know, for a lot of our employers, we are training their junior accountants in all of this technical stuff. So actually at interview, and in fact, most interviewers would probably expect you to have almost zero knowledge of these sorts of things. I mean, I remember when I went for my interview to get a job as an entry level, I was an auditor. I remember we talked about auditors a bit over the last couple of weeks. So I was an auditor for the first 3 years of my career in finance. When I went for that interview, they didn't even ask me if I knew what a P&L and a balance sheet was. They didn't even ask me if I understood double entry or if I knew how to use an Excel spreadsheet. I think the assumption would be that I didn't know any of that. What they were more interested in was the transferable skills that perhaps I'd already started picking up And those are the skills that are probably more relevant in other roles, other jobs, other activities. So, and again, there'll probably be some repetition from what we were talking about 5 minutes ago. Can you now start blasting the chat box with what are the transferable skills that you think accountants need or are important in a career in accountancy? Blimey, it's lighting up again. So what are the more transferable skills that are relevant in accountancy?
Communication is appearing as the most common to begin with.
Communication, always a big one. And absolutely, I mean, you know, the idea of accountants just sitting behind their computers, not talking to anybody, that just doesn't happen anymore. You know, accountants are, you know, talking to other people in the business, talking to people outside the business, communicating with another bank perhaps, talking to shareholders perhaps. So yeah, communication is an absolutely vital skill these days.
Teamwork.
Yeah, you know, we've already talked about that, but you know, realistically nobody can work in isolation on their own. And in fact, you won't even work at your best if you're working in isolation. You know, you work best when you're with a team of people who sort of complement each other's skills. You can, the whole becomes more than the sort of individual.
Commercial awareness.
Oh, love it, commercial awareness. And in fact, that's kind of one of the things that drew me into accountancy in the first place. I didn't really want to do all the number crunching, you know, inserting invoices into a system. I wanted to understand how businesses operated and how businesses worked. And that's very much what that kind of commercial awareness is about, just understanding how business models work, and therefore how you can perhaps make them better. That's that whole thing around advising directors of an organization.
And a methodical approach to work.
Yeah, good to be organized, good to be methodical. I mean, accountants will often have various tasks they need to undertake, maybe on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. You know, there's often processes and systems that you have to conform to. So absolutely having a methodical approach is really, really useful. But also, you can imagine that's quite handy if you work in all sorts of other jobs as well.
Yeah. One that might go back to your early years as an auditor, a challenging mindset.
Challenging mindset, what, asking awkward questions, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
That fundamentally, that's kind of the auditor's job, because remember, an auditor is looking at a prepared set of accounts and trying to identify, does it look accurate? Is it a true reflection of how the business is done? So in essence, auditors are asking awkward questions about, well, you know, prove to me that that sales figure is correct. Well, what if that cost figure is wrong? In fact, there's a term that the likes of the AAT and the ICAEW bandy around a lot, which kind of sums up that idea of asking awkward questions, but it's a bit posher. They call it professional skepticism. So not taking things at face value, not taking things for granted. If somebody tells you something, well, make sure you go and double check and see if you can find other things that will back it up. Any other useful points coming up?
Lydia's made one I think is getting more and more important, which is adaptability.
Absolutely. You just think about this last 5 months. You know, I think every single one of us in whatever form has had to adapt, show that kind of flexibility to the situation that we've all been facing, whether it's with, you know, your education, or if any of you have actually been in any kind of jobs, or just in your family relationships. You know, how do you actually interact with the people that normally you'd be spending a lot of time, you know, with in a kind of relatively close environment, which obviously hasn't been possible for a lot of time. So I'm really pleased actually, because you're all showing a really nice awareness now, I think, of the skills that are a bit more technical, a bit more specific, and therefore not actually that interesting, because you can always train the technical skills. What we're kind of thinking about is these transferable skills. I think these are the ones that you want to be thinking about more, you know, when you're pulling together CVs, when you're looking towards interviews. This is, I think, what they're going to be far more interested in. So, you know, focus on those transferable skills. We can always train the technical skills. Now, I've got a little video, so let's see if I can make the technology work. We actually talked to a number of our colleagues, and we asked them the question of what do they think are the 3 most important transferable skills for accountants. So I thought that you guys might be interested to hear this. This is a variety of the other tutors at FI. So bear in mind, they've been dealing with training accountants for years and years and years. And in fact, I do an awful lot of work with the likes of the AAT, the ICAEW, the big awarding bodies. I know their chief executives well, and I often ask them what the key skills an accountant needs. And interestingly, they very, very rarely say accounting. They very rarely say accounting is the key skill that accountants need. I think it's an assumed, it's a given that we know accountancy, but actually that's not what's really important, particularly if you want to have a good, sustainable career. If you want to be promoted and progress towards, who knows, board level, and management positions in big organizations, knowing how to do a bank reconciliation is really not going to cut it. So let's hear from, and this is Emma who's going to start us off.
Good morning, I'm Emma. I think the three most important things, transferable skills being an accountant, is firstly comprehension skills. So making sure that if you read some information, that you're actually able to understand what's being asked of you. So written information, more so than maths, I think. Secondly, having a willingness to learn new skills and having a willingness to take on new responsibilities and roles. And thirdly, I think in this day and age, it's really important to be a people person and to be able to understand people. Thank you.
What's that? Three most transferable skills? I would say communication. You need to be able to communicate your understanding, your findings, your suggestions and recommendations to a wide range of audiences. It will have all kinds of different levels of technical and financial knowledge. Secondly, adaptability, flexibility. You'll have a wide range of clients that you're dealing with, different industries, different sizes of business. You will probably really enjoy some of those. Some will excite you, some will be a bit more mundane, but you've got to be adaptable and flexible to deal with those situations. And finally, I'd say probably empathy, being your clients, being their businesses, understanding their personal goals, their motivation, their challenges, and just understanding their businesses. Yeah, I'd say those three.
Hi, I'm Gareth. Now, the last few years have seen a huge shift in the skills that accountants require. It's really not about numbers anymore. It's not about being numerate. You don't need to be particularly mathematical to be a good accountant. In fact, the key skills in accountancy these days, well, one I would say would be analytical ability. So being able to weigh up situations, look at the different alternatives. I think also problem solving, so maybe identifying the potential solutions to issues that businesses are facing, looking at pros and cons of different approaches. I think decision making is very important when you've weighed up those different approaches, that you can then decide which you think is the most appropriate, and actually then probably communication. So actually the ability to communicate in an effective manner, perhaps to the board of a company, what you think they should do to address their problems, but really not about numbers at all.
For me, the top three skills I would say an accountant needs to have are problem solving. You're going to come across loads of different scenarios and issues, and it's your job to be able to find solutions to those problems, whether they are financial and non-financial for a business. I think linked to that is then being able to have leadership, so actually be able to make decisions, bring people with you and motivate a team to follow the path that you're taking a business on. And coupled with all of that is then effective communication skills, not just written, but verbal as well.
Hi, my name is Ian, and I want to quickly tell you what I think are the three most important transferable skills for an accountant. Firstly, I think you need to have really good communication skills. Secondly, to be able to work as part of a team and get on well with others and motivate them. And finally, I would say to be able to be flexible, particularly around changing environments or in a variety of different roles. So you've got to be prepared to be able to apply yourself in different situations?
Hi, I'm Shelley, and I'm not an accountant. I work in the marketing department. But for me, the 3 skills that make an accountant really great are the following. Firstly, I think as an accountant, sometimes you have to take quite complicated information and you need to be able to translate that and turn it into something that somebody like me can understand. So that's a real skill. The second thing I think is probably relevant for a lot of office environments, but particularly for an accountant, you have to be a good listener. So you have to listen to everything that's being told to you, be able to kind of reformat that information, pull it together and take out the pieces that you really need. And lastly, I think sometimes as an accountant, you can get bogged down in the detail. You can get caught up in the numbers and the spreadsheets that you're working on. So one of the really great skills that you can develop is being a real team player. So teamwork is really important because it will help you to be more effective in your job.
Super. So, and in fact, you can see a lot of repetition there. I mean, those were recorded completely independently, and particularly communication. You can see, just how often that's coming up as a key skill. So, and you can imagine how, I often get, particularly, school leaver, sort of GCSE A level candidates who come to me interested in a career in accountancy, and they will say to me, "Oh, but I'd be no good as an accountant, would I? Because I'm not very good at maths." And you can imagine, nobody in that little video was talking about maths as being a necessary skill. So, it's much more people skills. It's much more those kind of interpersonal skills. So let me go back to my presentation. In fact, what I thought would be quite useful, we've talked a little bit on the summer school so far about apprenticeships. And I think I've hopefully made clear the fact that apprenticeships today are very, very different to how they were 5, 6, certainly 10, 15 years ago. And they're certainly not something that is only for people who aren't particularly academic or aren't particularly capable. Some of our very strongest students doing AAT, doing ICAEW, they do it as apprentices. Now, one of the great things about apprenticeships, I mean, you're probably aware there's government funding that covers apprenticeships, but one of the great things about apprenticeships is they actually cover a wider variety of skills than just the knowledge you need to pass some accountancy exams. So, somebody just doing AAT or just doing ICAEW, they would be focused on learning their tax rules, learning their double entry, just learning that more technical knowledge that we've been talking about, which is important. You do need that knowledge as an accountant. I'm hoping, as we've demonstrated, it's certainly not the most important part of being a good career accountant. You've got all these other more transferable skills. And just as an example, up there on the screen there are apprenticeships at different levels. There's a level 3, a level 4, a level 7, but actually level 3 is quite a common entry point for new people coming into accountancy. Just in front of you there, that's just a listing of these non-technical requirements of an apprenticeship. So these wider skills, these more transferable skills that are actually built into an apprenticeship program, and therefore that we train our apprentices in. So we train them in. And we heard analytical ability a number of times. We heard communication virtually every time, didn't we? Problem solving is on there. Team working, embracing change, that whole adaptability and flexibility, particularly in the last few months. So what I would suggest is, even though some of you, may not be in a job in accountancy or may not be apprentices yet, if this is perhaps where you aspire to, if you'd like to become an accountant, that these are the kind of skills that are looked for. So, it's worth you, I think, starting to think about, can you give examples where you have shown analytical ability or shown embracing change and adaptability? And in fact, Amy, I don't know if it might be useful, I think we've got a link to, we've got quite a useful little apprenticeship brochure designed for students, which gives a bit of an overview of apprenticeships in general. It talks about this level 3 standard, also the level 4 and the level 7. I don't know if you might drop a link to that in the chat box, actually, Amy, thank you. So there's a link in the chat box to a brochure that kind of lays out some of these for each of the different levels. So if you're more of a graduate going into something like ICAEW, it would be level 7. Although what you'll find is the standards for level 7 still require communication and team working and problem solving. It's just they require it at a different level. So this is where I think, you know, if some of you here wanted to get a kind of ahead of the game for, you know, building a useful CV, and we'll talk about this in more detail next week, or for preparing yourself for interviews, think about the examples that you have done in your own lives so far where you can demonstrate some of these. And actually, if I remember, I'll try and include the link to that brochure when I send out the recording of last week's session, actually, just so everybody's got that. But just on the subject of apprenticeships, because apprenticeships to me have been fantastic in actually formalising the development of some of these wider transferable skills. Remember, the ICAEW actually did an exercise last year where they looked at the different skills they felt a professional accountant required. And then they looked at which of those skills would map to other professions, like, say, law or architecture. And what they found was that 80% of the skills of an accountant were actually the same as skills in other professions. So very much those transferable skills. There was only about 20% of the skills of an accountant that were very specific to accountancy. So you can imagine, you know, most of the time of an accountant is actually spent doing things that aren't directly specifically about accountancy. But actually, we've got a second little video that I wanted to show you, which is actually an interview by Ian, one of our colleagues, who is talking to actually one of our apprentices. Now, we did hear 2 weeks ago from the AAT and the ICAEW, and particularly the ICAEW, the Chartered Accountancy Institute. You know, that's one of the major qualifying bodies for professional accountants. They're not the only ones. So, for instance, the apprentice that we're going to hear from actually studies ACCA, which is the certified accountancy body, fairly similar in a lot of respects to ICAEW, but just so that you don't get thrown by the terminology. So let's hear from Ian and Jodie.
Okay, Jodie, thanks very much for your time today. Just to give a little bit of a background for who you are, could you just tell me who you are and what company you work for and what your role is there?
So my name's Jodie. I work for a concrete company in their accounts department. Previously to that, I look older than I am. I already have a degree, a film degree, which is separate. Done nursing for a little while, and then I travelled for quite a long time. And when I come back, I decided I needed a job that I could see myself progressing in, and one that allowed me to have opportunities to do that. So I looked into accountancy. I first looked into doing AAT on my own, and, you know, paying for the course and seeing how I could finance that. And then I heard about apprenticeships, and decided that it'd probably be better for me if I got a job in a company first, and found out that, you know, certain companies were offering apprenticeships and doing the AAT course anyway. So I applied for this job as an accounts assistant, and I got the job. And then I done AAT level 2 and 3. And then once I'd done that, my company created a position for me as the assistant to the manager. And then from that, I transferred over to ACCA, and I'm currently on my 4th exam out of 13.
Awesome. How did you find that transition from AAT to ACCA, or how have you found it?
Actually, at that point, I'm going to pause the video just briefly, because what I think would be quite useful, because Jodie's going to be talking over the next few minutes about some of the skills that she uses at work. And I think this will be useful, you know, as you spot any of the skills she's using, chuck them into the chat box, actually. Let's just see if she's talking about any of the things we've already been mentioning. So feel free to, you know, annotate in the chat box as you hear her talking about the skills that she uses in her workplace.
It's really exciting. You know, you're going up like another level. I don't know whether like the technicalities of like the options, but you can do level 4 AAT and become a bookkeeper, can't you? And then you get exclusions for some of the ACCA exams. But I just wanted to get straight into ACCA and start getting that done. So I've done that, and it was it's exciting because the pass rate goes down. So like AAT is like 70%. So you think, oh God, like I've got to get 70. And then you start ACCA and their pass rate's 50%. And when you start, you realise why. There's a lot of information that you've got to study, but it's really in depth and it's really interesting, so it's worth it.
Awesome. Well, it's good to see you progressing all the way through there, and look forward to seeing you getting fully qualified for ACCA then as well, so you got all of those letters. Obviously you mentioned that you did as an apprenticeship, and so today we're covering quite a bit about transferable skills. For you, what transferable skills do you think you use in your role?
I definitely think talking to different members of staff and adapting my approach to them. It's a massive part of my job role. I have meetings with the finance director, the commercial director, sometimes the MD, and I have to really, the professionalism that I have in them meetings is different to how I am with my colleagues in my office. So adapting that and realising, how you can talk to people, how you send emails, is a big part, and you learn about that in the skills days and how to approach things and talk to people. So I use that all the time.
Oh, great. So you use some of the aspects that you covered in your apprenticeship training around communication skills, both sort of written and verbal communications. You sort of applied that then when you were dealing with different people at work.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. What other transferable skills do you think you've definitely used?
I think my timekeeping. When you come into the job, obviously it's new, you're an apprentice, and they give you loads of bits and they say do this, and you have to figure out what is important and what needs to be done straight away, what you've got a little bit of time to look over. You might have work that you really enjoy and you'll be doing that piece, and someone comes in and says, right, you need to do this, and it's a horrible piece of work that you don't want to do, but it has to be done. So you have to then be strict with yourself, move that to the side and get done what needs to be done. And you'll have they'll aim for, end of month things that need to be done. So you just have to adapt your timekeeping and make sure that nothing gets lost while you're doing it as well, so you don't forget one piece of work.
Excellent. So you really sort of touched on there with your organisation and your prioritisation, and adding your own to-do list as well. Your sort of adaptability every day to day, really, isn't it, that you're moving?
Yeah.
Great. And because there's going to be loads of people watching this who are interested in thinking about going into accountancy, is there any tips you can kind of give or sort of suggestions to people if they're umming and ahhing about whether to go down accountancy route, or any myths you feel you could dispel with them about it?
I feel like with the apprenticeship, you're so well looked after. So your skills days, they're not just going to give you the material and say, right, go and learn this. That's, you've learned how to do all these multiplications and things like that. You're qualified. It's not about that. It's about everything you do at work as well, and the contribution that your everyday work is going to put towards your qualification. With the ACCA, you have to have 3 years worth of work in the office. And I feel like the apprenticeship, it sets it out for you. So you're just sort of taken along the journey, if you see what I mean, and you don't have to worry too much about, do I need to do this? When do I need to do this by? There isn't any of that. It's all done for you. So you can concentrate on the stuff you're doing at work and learning new things at work while everything else is sort of being organised for you. And as long as you follow them steps and do everything in that order, it's brilliant. It's really good.
And then you come out as a qualified accountant.
Yes.
All looking good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today, and also shows the backdrop of a standard office for a finance person in a company with folders and paper all over the place. It's always great.
Paper everywhere. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Super. So, that gives you an idea, and you can see, Jodie very much talking about some of these transferable skills that we have been talking about being so important. In fact, you can imagine, somebody in her position fairly early on in her career who's actually dealing directly with the managing director, other members of the board of her company. That's got to be a great bit of personal development for her, just the exposure she's got to the most senior part of her organization. And that's not untypical of the trainees that we work with. Actually, some of the apprentices, they get incredible exposure to the highest level of the organizations that they work with. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the difference between practice and industry, if you remember. So practice is when you work for an accountancy firm and then go out and work, for clients that the firm is dealing with. Industry is when you're working in the finance function of the same business throughout the whole year. So Jodie obviously was in industry. She was working for the finance function of a particular company, and you can imagine the kind of depth of experience she gets within that particular company that she's working for. So I'm hoping that was a sort of useful insight. I just thought, actually, just to get a little bit of engagement here, I've got a little poll that I wanted to run today. So we've talked a lot about these different transferable skills, and hopefully those of you watching have some experience of some of them. So I've got a little question here. So which of the following skills do you feel least confident in demonstrating? Just give 30 seconds for people to have a think about this. So which of the following skills do you feel least confident demonstrating? I'll shut that down. Looks like most people have probably filled that in. So in terms of the overall results, well, quite a spread actually. Looks like overall, probably the big one is negotiation, by far and away the most people going for negotiation as being a concern there. But actually quite a broad spread. I mean, we quite often see people a bit concerned around leadership, quite a lot around timekeeping. I think particularly after the last 5 months or so, perhaps lots of individuals getting out of the habit of being certain places at certain times. But you can see from this, actually, it's very individual. Different people have different skills that they feel either stronger with or less confident with. What you should be looking to do is try and think about how you can make sure you are expressing. So, taking leadership, for instance, you don't have to have been a leader. You don't have to have been the captain of a team to demonstrate leadership qualities. You can be a leader of yourself or a leader of a pair of people, even if you're not the captain of an entire team. Even negotiation, you don't have to run high-level negotiation. I negotiate with my wife on a daily basis. I negotiate with my children on a daily basis about who's going to get access to the internet, or who's going to get access to different devices. So just start thinking about how you'll be able to demonstrate some of these particular skills. So if I put that away now, so let's take us back to our presentation. Okay, so bearing in mind our aims, so I'm hoping at this stage you've got a reasonable understanding of technical and transferable skills, and the fact that actually it's the transferable skills I would suggest you try and focus on when you're in interview. We've talked a little bit about the specific skills that are needed in accountancy. We've heard from a variety of tutors. We've heard from Jodie herself, an actual accountancy apprentice, in terms of the specific skills. You know, how often have we heard the word communication? How often have we heard about problem solving or decision making? So actually some very clear skills emerging from that. Just want to start moving towards the end of the session by thinking about actually how can you demonstrate these transferable skills in an interview situation. And I mean, you know, hopefully some of you may be going towards interviews in the coming months or the next year or two, whether it's looking for a job or potentially even looking for a next step in education. But actually we want to show you a couple of different ways of handling an interview. And remember, we're going to look at this in a lot more detail next week. So hopefully it's going to be a really valuable session around CVs and interview techniques next week. But let's have a look at a third video. Now, when you're watching this video, this is a classic mistake that people often make in interviews, and I think in CVs as well. Because remember, the CV is the first place a lot of employers will look before they even decide if they're going to take you to interview. And the big mistake I think a lot of people make is they focus too much on the technical side of whatever it is they've done. So let's see what goes on here with Shelley.
Right, so Shelley, thanks for coming in for the interview. Sorry, I have to do it via Zoom. Really interested to see what you might bring to this trainee accountant role that we've got here. And it'd be interesting just to start off with, if you can just let me know, granted you don't have any accountancy qualifications, but that's fine, that's what we expect. What kind of skills have you learned so far, either in work or what work experience you had that really sort of you think you could bring to being a trainee accountant?
Well, I work at Marks and Spencer's on Saturday. I work on the food section. So I've learned how to use the till, and I can use the credit card machine, and I help people when I'm on the till. And then when I'm not on the till, I have to go and work out on the shop floor. So I have to know where everything is. I have to be able to put the stock out properly. I have to be able to find things. So yeah, I guess that's it really.
Okay, yeah, and I suppose quite a few of those are quite sort of specific to working obviously in Marks and Spencer. Is there any that you feel real transferable skills that you've learned that you could bring into working as an accountant?
Now you can see there, actually the interviewer is really trying to help her out there because she has focused. Can you imagine, you know, if you know how to use the tills in Marks and Spencer's, is that a useful skill if you're going to go and work in an accounts office? You know, if you know how to, you know, put a load of chickens in the fridges to restock at the end of a shift in Marks and Spencer's, that's not a particularly useful skill if you're then going to become an auditor, is it? So the interview is actually trying to help her out by giving her an opportunity to expand on what she's done at Marks and Spencer's into more transferable skills rather than technical skills. And it's a good, I think, thing to watch for in an interview is if an interviewer asks you essentially the same thing twice, it means they don't think they've got quite enough out of you the first time and they're giving you a chance to give them more. So for goodness sake, don't say, no, I think I've told you everything. You know, they're giving you the chance to hopefully rescue things. So actually before we even hear from Shelley, what tips would you give her? Use the chat box. What can we suggest to Shelley to actually help her out here? Because it looks like she's done some things at Marks and Spencer's. So use the chat box. What would you advise Shelley to perhaps talk about or focus on? What transferable skills do you think she perhaps does possess that she can bring out now? Ooh, couple coming in now.
Flexible skill set. Quite good one.
Okay, flexible skill set. So Nick, what do you think we maybe mean by that?
Be able to do various different things. So not just being very narrow stuck on the till. She can then go to the shop floor. She can now help customers. willingness to turn your hand to anything.
Multitasking.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Team working.
Yeah, teamwork, and it sounds like she does work very much as part of a team.
Communication.
I mean, who would she be typically communicating, would you say, in her job?
Customers.
Yeah, absolutely, customers, and potentially difficult customers. In fact, a lot of employers in accountancy, they're very interested in people who have got that sort of retail or even hospitality experience, those kind of customer-facing roles. If you can deal with an angry customer in Marks and Spencer's, well, actually, maybe you could deal with an angry customer of an accounting company. Anything else coming out that we could suggest to Shelley that we can see? Yeah, I mean, you've got that communication with customers. I was also thinking there's going to be a lot of communication with her own colleagues, potentially in different parts of the business. She's presumably got colleagues on the tills, but also colleagues in the storeroom, her managers that presumably she has to work with.
Yeah, Zohar's got working collaboratively with team members.
Absolutely. So you can see she hasn't given her best, I think, face forward in that first phase of the interview. She's very much focused on those specific technical skills. Be like a footballer saying, oh, I can take penalties or I can dribble. If you're going for a job in an accountancy firm, they're not going to be interested in that stuff in the slightest. They want to hear about the transferable skills. So shall we see if Shelley can pull it out of the bag with a second chance to answer? So let's go back to Shelley part 2. See what she can come up with.
So, Shelley, some of those points, I suppose, were a little bit specific to working in Marks and Spencer. Is there any more really transferable skills that you think you learned in what you were doing there, which you could apply to being a trainee accountant with us?
Okay, so when I work on the till, quite often you come up against problems. There'll be things like an item will appear, it's got no barcode on it. Then what tends to happen is you have to go and get someone to come and get an item that's got the right barcode. You tend to find that customers get a little bit disgruntled about the fact they've got to wait. So one of the things that I need to do is make sure that everyone knows what's happening and that we're not just, sitting there having a chat. I'm actually kind of keeping things moving. I also as well need to do everything I can do to move things along. So that when that item appears, I can just scan it and go. So that's one thing. I think communication is really important in that scenario. You do get some difficult people as well, so you do have to kind of, negotiate with some people whilst you're on the till, especially if they're, impatient, they don't like waiting. But I think when you're out on the sales floor, that's sort of different entirely, because what we tend to find particularly early in the morning is that you get a delivery come in, and it's really important that that goes out in the right way. So, for example, all the frozen stuff has to go out first because obviously it's going to defrost. Then the fridge stuff needs to go in, and you can leave the kind of the sort of dry goods until the end. But what's really important is that if I finish up what I'm doing, I need to then go and see which of my colleagues needs to help, because it's a team effort. So I think team working is really important on the shop floor. And then finally, last year I was really lucky. I got given a slight promotion. I was made a till controller, and that's been really interesting because I'm actually having to manage people that are older than me, and some of them, they go off on their break time, they kind of wander back a bit late, they don't really want to come back, and they kind of think because I'm younger than them that they can just sort of do what they like. And I have had to have some difficult conversations with people that are quite a bit older than me, and that's been quite tricky.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think there's a lot of points you brought in there that we would use within the trainee accountant role. So really good. Thanks for that.
So you can see there that, literally based on the same previous job, same previous experience, I think a very different kind of, perception of what actually she would be capable of in a role in the accounts department. You can see it's really that shift from focusing on the purely technical skills to the more transferable skills. So I hope that was a kind of useful comparison to see. But some of you may well have not worked at Marks and Spencer's. The key is then, what about you? So actually, and again, let's go back to the chat box. I'm hoping we can get some good action here. Now, without worrying about skills at this stage, don't worry about the skills themselves. I'm just interested in you know, Shelley had experience working in Marks and Spencer's on the tills. What sort of experience, and it doesn't have to be work experience, it could be anything else you've done that you think might be relevant to a job interview. What sort of work experience and other examples of things you've done in your past could you use to demonstrate transferable skills? I'm not interested in the skills yet, we'll come to that in a second, but you know, what sort of experiences do those of you in the group have that might help you build this more constructive interview approach or CV? So start throwing a few things into the chat box for me. I'm thinking back, I did, for instance, Duke of Edinburgh, back when I was at school. That helped me learn how to get very, very lost in the middle of a big mountain in the middle of Scotland, if I remember rightly. But I'm sure I learned some stuff from that. I also did Young Enterprise. I don't know if anyone's ever come across the Young Enterprise scheme, which, you know, in theory helps you develop some of that commercial awareness. But, you know, so what sort of experiences do those of you on the call have?
So Gareth, the first things coming up, team sports, voluntary work, again, volunteering for a charity, organising a conference at university, part-time summer work.
That sort of stuff does all sound, and I think with team sports, I mean, obviously if you were the captain of a team, I think that gives a certain slant to the skills that might have brought to you, but you know, even just being a member of the team in itself can be quite useful. So, I mean, I actually came up with, and I did a bit of a brainstorm as to the hopefully pretty wide range of things that may be of relevance to some of you here. You know, so feel free to note these down, although we'll send the recording out. But, you know, any kind of part-time work, you know, if you're working in a pub, you know, I wouldn't suggest you talk extensively about the ability to mix cocktails. That's a more technical skill of working in a pub. But obviously working in a pub gives you huge amounts of customer contact and organizational ability and dealing with, you know, suppliers delivering drinks and whatever else. So, you know, any kind of part-time jobs, even at the extent of a paper round. I had a paper round when I was a kid, and that taught me an awful lot about organizational ability. Volunteering is great, you know, and volunteering is, you know, relatively easy to get hold of. Some of you on the call might have been prefects or even heads of your schools, you know, head girl or head boy. Any of you mentored or sort of tutored younger students? I think that can be fantastic as well. We talked about kind of events, but, you know, if you've done team games, and particularly if you've ever competed at any sort of relatively high level, you know, you can imagine, like, you know, I used to row when I was at school, and I competed in a sort of national championship. And again, it's not the technical skills of being able to row that matter, it's the kind of organizational ability, it's the ability to self-motivate, it's the ability to, you know, work as a team, you know, all of that stuff, absolutely crucial when you're in a rowing four. Some of you may have come across things like the ICAEW base event. It's an event that it runs with schools, like a business game. Some of you may have participated in that sort of thing. If any of you have spent time abroad, whether working or not, and some of you may have, I don't know, done ski seasons or, you know, worked in sunny environments. If you ran a club, I'd mentioned Duke of Edinburgh and Young Enterprise, a couple of things I think that are very useful to build in. If any of you, even on a low level, have a blog or a vlog that you do regularly, you know, that I think is fantastic. You know, even things like, you know, my daughters, we have a horse. And for me, part of the reason for buying my daughters a horse, firstly, so that they don't need to worry about boys for a few years, but it teaches them an awful lot about responsibility and about caring for, you know, an animal in this case, but, you know, caring for something else. So it actually teaches them a lot of valuable skills in life, I think. This last 5 months, you know, I would challenge any of you to not have some great examples from this last 5 months of how you've had to respond and adapt and be flexible. Maybe new methods of communication. You know, I talk to my parents using Zoom now. So, you know, the way you've coped with lockdown, I would imagine would give loads of great fodder for some of these sorts of things. Maybe additional studies you've taken on. You know, if you've learned a musical instrument, any kind of work experience you may have done. you know, hopefully all of you will have something from a list like that, or your own ideas that you can bring in. I mean, if you genuinely have nothing whatsoever, then this is the time to start thinking about maybe doing some volunteering, or, you know, joining a club, seeing if you can become captain of a, you know, hockey team or whatever. So, you know, because this is the sort of thing that I think gives great fodder in an interview to be able to talk about. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas. I thought we'd kind of start tailing off this by just thinking about what sort of skills we can then pick out. So actually, if I can ask my colleagues, have we got any good ones in the chat box in terms of what people have done? Did you mention volunteering?
Yeah, there's a few said volunteering and volunteering for charities.
Okay, let's go with that as a starting point. So volunteering is a charity. You know, let's all participate. Let's imagine we've all got experience of volunteering with a charity. Let's now specifically pull out which transferable skills that exercise is going to hopefully have helped us to build. So again, let's go to the chat box. Let's think about what transferable skills volunteering for a charity would allow you to expand on in a CV or in an interview.
Nice one from Charlie there, Gareth. An ethical mindset.
Brilliant. And actually ethics is hugely important in accountancy and finance. Actually every qualification, virtually every exam you study has an ethical dimension to make sure that you're not just doing things to make the most money, but you're doing things that are, you know, environmentally sustainable, or, you know, not taking advantage of underpaid labor, not polluting the environment. There's all sorts of ethical dimensions, and, you know, working for a charity, I think, would give you, you know, huge kudos in that sort of area.
Teamwork and communication as well.
Yeah, and you know, obviously in a CV or in an interview, you know, expand on exactly what element, because communication obviously is very, very broad. So I would talk specifically about what stakeholder groups, what different groups I might be communicating with. Whereas you can imagine in a charity, you've got communication with the people making donations, which I think is a very important part of, you know, raising the money that the charity wants to raise. But equally, you've got the communication with the ultimate beneficiaries. So, you know, if you're raising money for a hospice, you'd have the communication with the hospice itself, for instance. Any others cropping up there?
Working with a diverse range of people. Jenny?
Yeah, so, you know, that aspect of communication being with, you know, in fact, I think Jodie picked it up in her video, didn't she, that when she talked to her MD, she was obviously, you know, carrying herself in a very different way to perhaps when she was talking to her general colleagues. So, you know, that's that idea of just being able to change your communication style depending on who you're talking to, perhaps if it's a group or an individual. You know, the method of communication, you know, is it an email, is it a Slack message, is it WhatsApp, or is it a presentation that you're giving?
I think the thing also, Gareth, Phoebe has mentioned, in terms of volunteering, just going further than is required.
Yeah, great point, Phoebe. I mean, that's something I've always been a big believer in. You know, whatever you're asked to do in life, always do a little bit more. You know, even if you weren't asked for it, even if you're not being paid for it. I think that's actually how you end up progressing in life. You know, that's how you get promoted, is when people see that you give that kind of extra yard. So yeah, great idea, I think. And obviously, if you're volunteering, that's doing something, you know, although I know we do it sometimes to give us, you know, something for our CVs, but actually volunteering very much done for the good of the charity, perhaps, that you're volunteering for. So that's, so, you know, great ideas coming out from that. What if we think about one more, perhaps, as we tail off? So, you know, I know something that a lot of, you know, people might have experience with would be tutoring younger students or mentoring younger students. So, you know, what transferable skills would tutoring younger students perhaps help us develop? So last bit of interaction, last engagement, what sort of ideas have we all got? So tutoring or mentoring younger students, what transferable skills would that allow us to talk about in an interview? Starting to come through.
Got leadership come through.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, because you are going to have to take the lead with that younger student. So absolutely, you know, it may only be one of them, but that's still leadership. You know, communication, I guess, is one that would come out there, but communication with the younger student in terms of when you're trying to teach them, and, you know, teaching requires, you know, you can imagine it's a different type of communication to what you'd be talking to for the donors to a charity. You know, you've got to show patience and empathy in your communication. And, you know, when you're tutoring somebody, it's often about asking open questions. You know, you're not necessarily telling them what the answer is, you're helping them work the answer out. You know, I drive my daughters mad when they come to me with questions, because I never answer their questions. I help them answer their questions. Drives them a bit mad, but actually it's probably better for them. Any others coming through?
Motivating and encouraging.
Yep, which, you know, that is an absolutely brilliant skill in any area of life. Whether you know, you can imagine you don't need to be the captain of a football team to motivate other players on the football team. You know, it can be just as well one of the other team members who are doing the motivating. And obviously, if you are teaching a younger student, you know, I'm sure me and my colleagues have all got experience of teaching people who have, you know, got to the end of their tether, losing the will to live with something, and you've got to keep them going, you know, through tough exams. So absolutely, you know, motivation, you know, being able to motivate a team is, I think, a key part of leadership. So in fact, you know, if you're asked to demonstrate leadership qualities, you know, just the ability to motivate and inspire other people, give other people the energy to keep going when things are challenging, I think is very powerful.
Organisation, so preparing lesson plans.
Yeah, got to be very organised. I guess timekeeping as well would probably sneak in as being a key transferable skill for mentoring. You know, when you arrange to meet, and if they're going to send work to you and you've got to look at it and then send it back to them before they have an exam. So, you know, timekeeping, organisational skills. That's a few great. Yeah, empathy, you know, understanding. You know, I always think in our job as tutors, it's always helpful if you failed a few exams, because if you failed a few exams, you therefore know what it's like. So if students that we're teaching fail exams, which happens, these are very, very challenging exams, actually you can put yourself more in their position. Super. Well, that's kind of what I wanted to finish off with, is hopefully giving everyone, and I know not everybody will have tutored younger students, not everyone will have, you know, volunteered for a charity, but hopefully if you think about the experiences you have had, whether it's Duke of Edinburgh, whatever else it might be, you can start seeing the way you can pull out some of these key transferable skills. And I think, you know, even at a CV stage, and we are going to look at this in more detail next week, but in a CV, I think the worst thing you can do almost is just list the things you've done. Just list a very factual list of, well, I did this for 7 months, and then I had this job at Marks and Spencer's, and then I volunteered for that charity. That's of no value to anyone. I always think you need to make sure that for each thing in your CV, you're clearly saying, what impact did it have on you? What did it deliver to you in terms of perhaps skills? So clearly detailing the kind of transferable skills that working at M&S gave you, the teamwork, the communication, the volunteering for the charity gave you, the organizational skills, the analytical ability, whatever it might be, to make it very clear to the person writing the CV, reading the CV, what it is that your skills might be able to bring to their organization, and therefore to actually encourage them to take you forward to interview, where you can then talk about it in all sorts of loving depth and detail. So I'm hoping that's been a kind of useful exercise. As usual, you know, feel free to sort of put things in the chat box if you've got specific questions you want us to answer. But that is the third session pretty much rounded off then. So we're back for the final session next week. And again, we are going to look in a bit more detail at CV interview preparation. We've got some more useful videos, interviews with some recruitment consultants, for instance, interviews with people who conduct lots of interviews, to try and help that next stage of the process, where if what we've done over the last 3 weeks has interested you and intrigued you about careers and finance, if you are thinking that you might make that next step towards applying for roles, maybe looking for potentially an apprenticeship position, or look to start something like AAT or ICAEW, how to go about finding those roles and how to then handle the kind of questions you might get in an interview. So hopefully I will see some of you next week. We'll send out the recording hopefully in the next few days, both of last week and of this week. But yeah, if anyone's got any sort of final questions, feel free to start putting them in the chat box. But thank you very much for your attention today. Been really good to talk to you all, and I'll see you next week, hopefully. Oh, Daniel, diolch to you as well. Not often I see that in my chat boxes.